Journey IFC strives to create safe spaces to worship God. Know that you are welcome just as you are, regardless of religious background or lack thereof, skin color, political affiliation, sexuality, age, culture, or any other label you own or society throws on you. You are welcomed and celebrated here just as you are.
We're going to have a reading here in a minute, but it's not from a part of the Bible you may be really familiar with. It's from Acts 12, and it's about a disagreement. There were two guys, Paul and Barnabas, and they're like first missionaries ever, and they travel around and try to just talk to the various communities of believers after Jesus' death. And so they work together, they heal people, they share the news about Jesus. And Barnabas has a cousin named John, who was also called Mark. So a lot of times we call him John Mark, not to be confused with other Johns in the Bible. This is not the John the Baptist. This is a different guy. This is a kid. He's like a teenager. And so John Mark had gone with Paul and Barnabas on one of their little mission trips. But he somehow we don't know what happened, whether he lost interest or what happened. John Mark left them and went home. So that's where we're picking them up today as we read the story. I believe that Paul and Barnabas are talking about going on their next mission trip. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Come, let us return and visit the believers in every city where we proclaimed the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul decided not to take with them one who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not accompanied them in the work. And the disagreement became so sharp, they parted company. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and set out, the believers commending him to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches.
So, as you can tell, we have a short reading today, but it needs a good bit of backstory to better understand it. And Gail gave some of that, but I'll probably revisit that in what I'm saying here. So last week we talked about Peter, right, and how he was freed from prison and how he was helped by this angel, and he goes through all these thresholds, and we talked about, the people that help us cross thresholds. And the last one was at the house of the mother, Mary, the mother of John Mark, who is one of our characters today. And you may remember we talked about Rhoda and how we're all responsible for helping one another cross these thresholds of life, and how this can be hard work. But it also is tied up in our liberation and how we're supposed to liberate one another and all be freed. Well, today we're going to take a little pivot and we're going to look at a story about John Mark. And like Gail said, some clarification around names. In this point, everyone had several names, it seems. They had their Greek name, their Hebrew name. Sometimes Jesus gave them like a third name on top of that. There's like a bajillion Ananiases, which I guess was a common name then. So many Johns, so many Marks, so many James, we even have a character named Bar Jesus today. So we can get kind of mixed up, but for today, we're going to call him John Mark, just to make it simpler for our story. And at this point, we know that he is a young man. He's a teenager, like Gail said. So we're told that Paul and Barnabas have been sent on this mission. And so in these missions, they would go out throughout the world and they would spread word about Jesus, and they would convert as many Jews as they can. That was pretty much their first target because they were the people that were closest to them. And then they'd go from there and do the Gentiles, the other people, the people that were not included before. And so what they would do is they would go to this region and they would go to the town center and they would find the synagogues and they would go and preach to the Jews about Jesus. And sometimes that worked. It was kind of like a 50-50. Sometimes people were like really into it and accepted it. And then sometimes people were like, no, this is blasphemy. And they would have a rebuttal and, caused a lot of tension. And so they started spreading news to Gentiles as well. They're like, well, if these Jews won't take this news and run with it, we'll spread it to other people. And so what they would do is they would travel very far. It was kind of crazy how far they traveled in this time. They even sail across the Mediterranean Sea for their work, and they do it several times in this story as well. These men were busy, but they also were they're partners in business. They were friends. They worked well together, and their skills fit well together. And it's interesting, if you look at the meaning of their names, you can see why they're a good fit. Barnabas, his name means son of comfort, and this was actually given by Jesus. And so we can assume that he's probably a caring guy. He is a comforting person, a comforting presence. But then Paul in the story, who you may remember was formerly Saul, his name actually harks back to his conversion story, because Paul means humble or small or to make smaller. And in his conversion story, he was on the road to Damascus when the resurrected Jesus appeared to him in a blinding light, and he was blinded, and it changed his life. And he went from persecuting Christians to being like the biggest pro-Christian guy there was. And so he kind of has this rough edge to him. So we have Barnabas, this caring guy, and Paul, who had to be made smaller, to be humbled from his past as a persecutor. So these two needed one another. For some reason, they were more successful when they worked together on these missions. However, we have a third character, like we talked about, John Mark. And like I said, he was a younger guy, and he happened to be the cousin of Barnabas. And for some reason or another, John Mark was brought alongside Paul and Barnabas as some type of helper, maybe like a scribe or an assistant or an apprentice. We're not sure, but he was there to do the work with them. And on their first mission altogether, they had crossed over to the island of Cyprus, which was a bit of a journey, and they ministered across the island. They healed people and spread the news about Jesus. And there's this interesting story where they even converted a group of sorcerers, and one of them was Bar Jesus, who they did not like. They condemned, but they get converted in this kind of crazy story. Kind of the entire book of Acts, there's these crazy conversion stories. That's really what it's all about. But it says that once they made it across the island, they sailed further, even further across the Mediterranean Sea to a town called Perga, which this is in modern day Turkey, which is awesome that we have someone in Turkey with us here today, because that just feels cool. I didn't even plan that. That's cool. And this is where we're told that John Mark returns home back to Jerusalem, all the way from Turkey to Jerusalem. And this was crazy. This is a huge journey, and he takes it alone. It makes me wonder, why did John Mark leave this mission? What happened? The text doesn't tell us really at all. It just kind of assumes, he went back home, and we're supposed to fill in the gaps. It could be, a theological disagreement. They probably had a lot of those as these people who were early, Christian Jesus movement followers. He probably was tired. Maybe it was fatigue, or maybe it was job burnout. I know a lot of us are feeling that in the pandemic right now. Maybe it was homesickness, or maybe it was something completely else that we don't know. Whatever it was, though, John Mark now had to make this long and dangerous journey back home alone. And I assume that this gave him a long time to think about whatever caused him to leave in the first place. In my research this week, I heard someone preach on this story, and they called John Mark a failure. And then I read some articles that related him to Jonah and called him the New Testament Jonah, and said he was running away from his calling, seeing what he did as somehow not measuring up to what he was supposed to be doing. But I'll be honest, the empath in me couldn't come to this same conclusion. It didn't feel like it had enough grace in it. Something had happened to this young man that made him want to go home, and he took the risk and followed his gut and did that. He went home. Our reading today comes sometime after this event. Sorry. Paul Here we go. Paul and Barnabas, they've continued their work of healing and spreading the news, about Jesus, this gospel as they called it. And this was without John Mark. He was back home. But we know that Paul and Barnabas's relationship was not perfect. They had many disagreements, both theological and practical, along the way. And they even had councils where they had to come back and kind of, iron out some of their disagreements on circumcision and all this stuff. And the time has come for them to make another journey. And Barnabas wants to check back in on John Mark and ask him to go with them. And of course, this causes a fight. So Barnabas and Paul cannot agree on whether or not to take John Mark with them on this next journey. Paul, still mad about, what John Mark did last time, leaving. He can't give grace to John Mark. He assumes he will do the same thing over again. He's gonna desert them whenever they need him most. Paul, ironically, and in spite of his own name, meaning to be humbled, doesn't seem to think that John Mark can do it. He thinks that he's too small for the role. But Barnabas seems to stick up for his cousin, which I really love. And it's, kind of expected from Barnabas with a name like, son of comfort. We kind of expect him to be the comforting message in this story, and he is. But this disagreement causes this great duo to split. They'd work so well together, but somehow this argument causes them to go separate ways. A friendship and a business relationship divided. And I'll be honest, we've probably all seen this in our own lives. Best friends break up, they go their own ways, feelings are hurt. And if this doesn't happen in your life, you'll see it on like every TV show that has two friends. They always seem to break up, and they typically come back together, but sometimes they don't. Barnabas leaves with John Mark at this point, and they go their own way, and they sail back to the island of Cyprus. And Paul chooses Silas, and they head another way, all while being commended by these so-called Jesus followers. If the story ended there, just this division, this split, it would be pretty grim, right? It would be a story of a ruined friendship and a failed ministry. Now it's all we would know. And I bet some of us here have felt that some of our stories have ended this way. We have found ourselves having to return home alone with the guilt of not measuring up, weighing us down the entire way back. It's a gap, right? The space between our expectations and our reality. The gap between what is expected of us and what we really have to offer the world. The distance between our desires and our gifts, our hopes and our assumed failures. And this is the gap John Mark finds himself into. It can be hard to live up to others' expectations of us, but I believe sometimes it can be even more difficult to live up to the expectations we have of our own lives. But like I said, the story does not end there. See, we don't hear any more about Barnabas and John Mark throughout the rest of the book of Acts. But we can assume that they still did their work. They continued their mission, and they went their separate ways. And so did Paul. We definitely know he did. We hear a lot about Paul. The relationship was strained and the space was made, but their journeys went on. And later in some of Paul's letters that he wrote to some of the churches and the people that he had helped plant churches with, we hear reference back to John Mark. He's called a fellow worker in the letter to Philemon. And Paul even states that John Mark is helpful to his ministry and ask him to come and help him in the second letter to Timothy. And as some people in history have suggested, the Gospel of Mark has been attributed to John Mark, believing that he wrote that gospel himself. In all of this, if we believe that or not, we see that the story doesn't end there. And that relationship that was once thought of lost and seen as a failure was mended somehow over time. John Mark, this young man who had to return home, became an influential pastor, a Jesus movement leader, in fact. And his story was not that of a failure by any means. In fact, I wonder how much strength it took him to return back home alone. How much strength did it take to return to ministry despite it breaking up this power duo? And how much strength did it take to cross these gaps? Journey in a time overrun by mass burnout, I wonder if John Mark's example can teach us anything. What happens when we give up and we make the hard decision to return home? What happens when we choose ourselves over others' expectations of us? What happens when we hear God's voice telling us to do less and care for our souls more? I think these gaps can be a terrifying space to find ourselves in. And there's a good chance when we find ourselves in these gaps, we'll have to go through them alone, just like John Mark. But maybe it doesn't mean that we have failed or that we are failures. Maybe it means that we have succeeded in staying true to our needs. And maybe that is exactly where God is calling us to go right now. And as the song at the beginning of our gathering, who had Grace Pettis, who is a journeyer at large, as Margaret said, as that song reminded us that maybe in this great divide, as they called it, maybe on this ground that we currently stand, maybe this too can be the promised land. Amen. So now I want to open up for discussion. We've been doing this on our Zoom days. And I have some questions, but before we get there and before we get too far into it, I want you to just take a minute to sit with this question. And I think Gail's going to put it in the chat for you, but it's just a simple sentence. And it says, I am stuck in the gap between blank and blank. And I want you, if you have something to write this down on, or if you want to put it in your phone, if you just want to mark it in your head, or you can even write it in the chat, whatever feels right to you. I want you to fill in these gaps. Where do you think you're stuck? Is it the gap between what others expect of you and what you expect of yourself? What your desires are, what your reality is? Fill in that space and just take some time to think about that.
Amen.
Amen.
And now we come to the end of our time together for today. It's been such a wonderful, strengthening time. This has been so great to talk together and to just be present with each other. And I ask, I just want to speak a blessing over each one of you, wherever you are, in whatever situation you find yourself, and just bless you with the knowledge that God is here through us, with us, and in us. Amen.
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 Amen.